So hello, everybody. We're just going to wait here for about one more minute. I see people are being logged in right now. So we'll get started as soon as we reach the critical number of participants in about a minute or so. Okay. All right, let's get started since we only have an hour here. First of all, welcome everyone to the first in a series of webinars examining the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Just so you know, this session is being recorded. All of you are in listen mode, currently only listen mode. We will at the end have a Q&A session, and I'll describe for you then how you can participate that in a minute. As I said, this is part of a webinar series whose purpose is to systematically explore the elements of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as framed in the UN Guiding Principles, and to educate and support investors as they assess and engage with their portfolio companies on their human rights performance. Beyond investors, we're hoping that this webinar will also be of interest to portfolio companies that need to disclose to investors their human rights commitments and performance, as well as hopefully also to civil society organizations and other stakeholders that are seeking to hold companies to account for their human rights performance. If you haven't had the chance to do so, please do view our video logs on the Investor Alliance YouTube channel. We'll share the link to that with you at the end of the webinar. You will also be receiving a recording of this webinar and the webinar slides with all those links. But in a nutshell, we have two video logs from myself and Investor Alliance Director Anita Dorette, talking a little bit about the series and what the corporate responsibility to respect is, also discussing what human rights are and why investors should care about human rights. In addition, we have a video log from Camille Lepore at the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, who we'll be hearing from shortly, discussing the relationship between human rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, and ESG. And just yesterday, we posted another video log from Mark Hodge at Shift, which examines Shift's leadership and governance indicators for rights-respecting corporate culture. Isaba, if you could advance to our speaker slide. So in addition to myself, sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, the Associate Program Director. We'll be hearing next then from Camille Lepore, who is the lead for the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. And after that, we are going to have an interesting, hopefully, exchange between Lauren Compare, Head of Stewardship and Engagement at Boston Common Asset Management, as well as Pat Sarega, who is Senior Director of Shareholder Advocacy at Mercy Investment Service. And they will be telling us, sharing with us some stories from the trenches of their years-long experience engaging with companies. In terms of our agenda, and thank you, Isaba, for being in the background and helping us go through these slides here. We are going to start off, as I said, I'm going to discuss very briefly, provide a kind of review of the components of a good human rights policy, as well as what effective embedding and governance of that policy looks like. Then Camille, as I said, will talk to us a little bit about how the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark goes about assessing and ranking companies on their human rights performance, in particular in relation to policies and the embedding of those. And then, as I said, we'll be hearing from Pat and Lauren on some lessons from their experiences conducting dialogues. And we'll have 10 minutes, if we stick to time here effectively, for a Q&A and discussion. Okay, so why don't we get started then, and I'll try to provide you a bit of an overview. One more slide, Isaba, please, of the key elements of a human rights policy as laid out, in particular in Guiding Principle 16 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So there are in particular 5 key elements mentioned in Guiding Principle 16. The first is the importance that any human rights policy be signed off by senior level management, and that the board or a board committee be specifically tasked with oversight of that policy and its implementation. The idea here is to set a type of tone from the top for a corporate culture that respects human rights. In addition, it's very important that in the formulation of this policy that the company draw on internal and external expertise. The level of expertise needed to develop that policy may depend on the complexity of a company's operations, and it is always wise to consider consulting with likely impacted stakeholders and or their representative organizations when formulating that policy. The policy itself should be readily publicly available, ideally easily found on the company's website, and actively communicated internally to personnel as well as externally to relevant entities within the value chain with which the company has business relationships, think here subcontractors, partners, subsidiaries, and the like, as well as to other relevant stakeholders with which the company has ties. This could be things like investors, as we're discussing here today, as well as government entities and potentially impacted stakeholders. In addition, the policy should be expressly grounded in international human rights frameworks, and at a minimum, mention the company's adherence to the human rights norms that are outlined in the International Bill of Human Rights, which is based on 3 documents: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as the ILO Declaration on the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Next slide, please, Asaba. In terms of the embedding of the human rights policy in governance and management systems, there are some key considerations that the company needs to take into account. First of all, it's really important that the policy should be embedded throughout all business functions, and really the policy should provide a type of overarching framework for a rights-respecting corporate culture. That also entails ensuring that there's policy coherence between that overarching human rights policy and other policies and procedures that govern business activities and relationships. So, for example, think of procurement activities, compliance efforts, human resources management, any performance incentives for staff to adhere to and implement the policy, as well as policies the company may have in place regarding lobbying and political spending and so on. It should be very clear who has responsibilities within the company for operationalizing the policy and who has accountability for its implementation. And those efforts should be adequately resourced. The company may also choose to clarify in the policy what some of its most salient human rights issues are, recognizing, of course, that these salient human rights issues may change over time. And should also identify what processes in place to understand its human rights risks and address those, as well as how the company plans to account for and communicate any actions it's taking to manage those human rights risks. There should also be a clearly articulated recourse to action for internal and external stakeholders when they become aware of or experience any failures to uphold and implement that policy. And finally, the policy should be subject to a periodic review process as changes occur in the nature of the business activities of the company or in the operating context. So next slide, please, Asaba. So I realize that was a very high level overview of what a good human rights policy should entail and what embedding of that commitment looks like. I just want to direct you to a few resources that may be of value to you. These are all hyperlinked. You will receive these, as I said, when we send out the recording and slides of this webinar. Just want to draw your attention in particular to a few things with regards to benchmarking methodology. Hyperlinked here is the human rights, the corporate human rights benchmarks methodology. In particular, I would encourage everyone to look at Theme A, which Camille is going to tell us about in a second. For companies, there are some very useful reporting frameworks out there if they'd like to report to investors and other stakeholders about their policy commitments and their efforts to embed them. For example, the Shift and Mazur's RAFI framework. And then there's some really good guidance out there, both for companies in terms of developing a human rights policy, like the Global Compact's resources here, as well as for investors who are developing a human rights commitment, in particular, our own investor toolkit on human rights. And I also would like to draw your attention to Shift's resource on leadership and governance indicators. I encourage you to watch Mark Hodges' blog on that. It's a really useful set of indicators for understanding and evidencing how companies are really seeking to attain that right culture, everything from the kind of principles that they need to adhere to and really bring to fruition within the company, as well as some very concrete measures that need to be taken place and need to take place in terms of oversight and commitment from the highest levels of management and the board. So I am now going to pass things on to Camille to take it from here and do with us a bit of a deep dive into the corporate human rights benchmark. Camille, thanks so much for being with us today. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Rebecca. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here and participate in this webinar series in the first episode or webinar in this series. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I will talk a bit about how we actually assess human rights commitment and embedding through the corporate human rights benchmark. And I will leave time for a few questions at the end as well. And very quickly for context, so I work at the World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA. It's a non-profit foundation which assesses the most influential global companies on their contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we do this through a number of different benchmarks, including the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, or CHRB, which focuses on the human rights performance and disclosures of companies in high-risk sectors when it comes to negative impact. So that's for the context. We do this assessment through a methodology. And if we go to the next slide, please, we should see the, perfect, thank you, the different measurement areas. But so this methodology was first published in 2016. It's based on internationally recognized instruments, the most important of which is the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, UNGPs, and also was developed through extensive multi-stakeholder consultations. It was updated in 2020-2021, so we published a revised version of the methodology in September of last year. And again, this update was done through desk-based research, bringing the methodology up to date with the latest developments in the business and human rights field, but also new developments, new instruments that came out, and multi-stakeholder consultations. The methodology has 5 measurement themes or measurement areas. That's what you can see on the slide. We've got governance and policies in measurement theme A. We also assess companies on how they embed these policy commitments and undertake human rights due diligence. That's measurement theme B. Under measurement theme C, we look at remedies and grievance mechanisms. And then measurement themes D and E are all about performance. So looking at company human rights practices in relation to specific risks in measurement theme D, and then looking at responses to serious allegations under theme E. So for today, we're focused on measurement themes A and B. So I'll go through them quickly, how we assess companies on these themes, and I'll share a bit about some changes that we did through the methodology review, and some comments also on specifically what we look for. But starting with measurement theme A, so governance and policy commitments. With this measurement theme, we focus on so companies' human rights policy commitments, and then also how the company's governed when it comes to human rights. And so we've got 2 sub-themes. The first one focused on policy commitments. I've put all the indicators on this slide, but essentially for the policy commitments indicators, which are worth 5% of a company's total score, we look at the extent to which a company acknowledges its responsibility to respect human rights, but also how through these policy commitments, it formally expresses essentially a promise to uphold these rights. So we've got a general commitment to respect human rights as the first indicator. Then we go a bit more specific into commitments related to the human rights of workers. Then we look at commitment to respect human rights, particularly relevant to this sector for vulnerable groups. So this might be, for example, for the extractive sector, looking at indigenous groups. And then also a commitment to remedy, which is looking at whether the company is committed to providing effective remedy when things go wrong. And then a commitment to respect the rights of human rights defenders as a particularly vulnerable group. Then we've got board level accountability, also 5% of the company's total score. And And that's where we look at how the company's policy commitments are managed as part of the board's role and responsibility. So really looking at how the topic is treated at the top levels within the company. So we look at commitment from the top, board responsibility, incentives and performance management, and then, and this is a new indicator, business model strategy and risks. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'll quickly go through some of the changes that we've implemented as part of the methodology review that we did last year and the year before. We're giving, so that's the general change that we've done throughout the methodology, is giving more space to stakeholder voices. And that actually translated practically in removing an indicator we had previously on commitment to engage with stakeholders. This is because we really wanted to put the focus on evidence of actual engagement with stakeholders. And so what we've done is we've integrated that stakeholder engagement element throughout the methodology so that it's really grounded in what's being done as opposed to what's committed to by companies. We also added supplier expectations for the commitment to remedy. We previously had these under score 2, but it felt like moving them to score 1 was in line with the way things were going in terms of the importance of supply chain when it comes to providing remedy. For human rights defenders, when we first developed the methodology back in 2016, this was a very emerging topic. What we've done now is we've gone with where things have been evolving. We've moved supplier expectations to score 1 and added a requirement to commit to work with human rights defenders to get a score of 2. And then when it comes to board responsibility and incentives, there's now a requirement to describe how affected stakeholders or human rights experts inform discussions, so this kind of outside-in perspective. And then board incentives and performance management, we look now at the coherence between board incentives and human rights policy commitments so that there's no contradiction between the two. And then we also have this new indicator on business model strategy risks, which I mentioned. If we can go to the next slide, please. I've actually put the whole indicator on there because it's new, so it's all new on there. It's what one of my colleagues calls the revolution indicator. This is about looking at a company's business model and the inherent risks, human rights risks that that business model can carry, and therefore how that should be thought about and reflected upon by the company. So one example could be fast fashion as a business model that carries certain human rights risks in the apparel sector. Now going to the next slide, please. A note on research, because this is something that comes up often from companies, and so I'm sure it will also come up in some engagement calls that you might have with companies, is the specific language. We do require language that expresses a clear, explicit commitment, so essentially any form of promise that companies will uphold the specific rights or standards that we're looking for. And so this means that where language is ambiguous, vague, or weak, this is considered insufficient to qualify as a clear expression of commitment. And the reason for this is that when a commitment is clear, it carries a certain number of consequences legally. It triggers a range of internal actions that will be necessary to meet that commitment in practice. And so that's why we pay so much attention to clear, unambiguous language, which says a clear commitment from the top and doesn't leave any doubt that there's any cherry picking in terms of the rights that the company's respecting and the ones that it's leaving aside. So now looking at embedding, if we can go to the next slide, please. This is where we look at how all these policy commitments are then embedded throughout the company through a set of systems and processes that should be established. And so there we look at embedding respect for human rights in company culture and management systems. And then we also look at human rights due diligence. Again, I've put all the indicators on the slide. This goes from, again, incentives and performance management for senior managers, also communication of commitments with workers and external stakeholders, but also with business relationships, training, monitoring and corrective action, also engaging and terminating business relationships according to respect of these commitments, and then approach to engaging with affected stakeholders. So it goes back to the point I made earlier. And then under measurement theme B2, which is worth 15% of a company's total score, there you've got the 5 steps of human rights due diligence. So looking at how a company identifies and manages and communicates about its human rights risks and impacts. So there again, a few changes that we've made. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So there again, when it comes to incentives and performance management, but this time for senior management, before it was about the board, there again, we've added a requirement to make sure that there's that coherence between incentives and policy commitments. Integration of human rights risks into broader enterprise risk management. That's something that's crucial to ensuring that the embedding is systematic. There's a new requirement for a concrete example to get a score of 1 there, because we found that often descriptions were a bit vague, and so a concrete example would be a better way of assessing what's actually taking place within companies on this topic. When it comes to training workers on human rights, we've gone from asking companies to indicate that they do it to actually describing how they do it. So looking for more depth and more color to that. And then when it comes to human rights due diligence, we've implemented a few changes, mostly on score 2, because we wanted to keep score 1 as similar as possible from before, especially because of the engagement that has been taking place with companies that scored 0 on human rights due diligence. But we've added heightened due diligence requirement for conflict affected areas. Again, this stakeholder involvement point, which has been added to every one of the 5 human rights due diligence indicators. And then we're looking at concrete examples of how companies communicate with affected stakeholders about the due diligence process. And if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm conscious of time. I don't want to run over too much, but just very quickly in terms of best practice in what we're looking for. Well, of course, we're looking for companies to meet the specific requirements in each indicator, but as a general rule, if information is accessible and has clear and ambiguous language, it's much more likely that the company will be able to get points. We often look for a certain level of detail. So this change from indicate to describe is an example of this, because we're dealing with mostly qualitative information. And so some level of detail is needed to make sure that what the companies are describing is actually what we're looking for. Then we also look for evidence that for disclosures that show a systematic approach as opposed to isolated case studies. But of course, practical examples can be very helpful in some cases. And so in some indicators, we do look for specific examples for companies to score maximum points. The meaningful information point, this is related to the need for detail, but we don't want companies just to tell us they do something. We want them to tell us how they do it, and with what purpose, with stakeholder engagement, who do they engage with, how do they identify who they will engage with, how does that impact their activities and their approach, and then where's the feedback loop with those stakeholders. You only really get that if there's enough detail. A willingness to discuss challenges openly is crucial for transparency, because if we wait for everything to be perfect, then we can wait a long time for transparency to increase. but also discussing challenges openly often is kind of the first step to overcoming them. And this is linked to the next point on progress over time. We want companies to disclose progress over time and the progress they're making to reach their targets. And then we also want disclosures that demonstrate action all the way from commitment to performance. So often companies will make a commitment, but then disclosures really drop when it comes to what happens in practice. So we're really pushing companies to get closer to performance and essentially impact on the ground, so that these policy commitments that are put in place eventually lead to the effects they're intended to put in place. So that's it. There's more available online, but yeah, I'll stop here and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Camille. That was really useful. And I know that a number of our investors often receive questions from the companies they're engaging with, trying to better understand what sometimes for them to be valuing those scores. So I think it's really good to have this, and I encourage folks to take a closer look at the methodology that's being used. Before I open it up to questions, I'm going to ask everyone to please put their questions in the Q&A and not in the chat function. I just was curious, Camille, you describe here with some of the changes, really, I would say an increased robustness and rigor to how you're assessing companies, both in terms of the policy itself, with requirements around really effective stakeholder engagement, asking also, as you said, for concrete examples of what that looks like in the way that risk is considered, not just, risk linked to business models, risk linked to impact on defenders, the kind of incentives you're looking to see in terms of incentivized with regards to their human rights performance, and I could go on. I'm just curious, we've seen in past years that companies struggle with meeting the human rights due diligence expectations, and the scores haven't been for some companies nearly as good as we would hope. Do you think that increasing the rigor will cause potentially a drop in the number of companies that gain, I guess, passable scores with regards to the due diligence, their due diligence efforts?
So I think it's possible that we might see a drop in scores. With the human rights due diligence indicators, we really try to focus the changes on score 2. So in a way, we're looking at leading practice and those companies that already have a passable score, and it's kind of going above and beyond that. And yeah, so the change will be more in looking at the leaders when it comes to the human rights due diligence indicators and best practice out there, and kind of trying to raise the bar there rather than the minimum expectations. Because yeah, as you said, so many companies were already not meeting those requirements, the score 1 requirements. So we didn't want to touch these too much. We want to get those companies to get to the basic requirements. I'd say also it's, when we assess companies, there's a huge gap between those companies that are leading and those companies that are the majority of companies that are lagging behind. And so that's why having this score 1 requirements and score 2 requirements is something we played with, so that we can still push the bar and raise the bar and go for those leading practices, while still keeping things reasonable for those companies that are more early on, I guess, in their business human rights development.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Companies on that journey, and recognizing, of course, that some are farther along. Alison Bertet actually has a question asking more specifically, what's your advice for striking the right balance between including detailed examples of how a company is doing things and drafting a policy that's somewhat timeless and future-proof? So I guess also to the level of specificity, we discussed maybe including salient risks as an example, sharing a bit about the due diligence process in the policy. What level of specificity do you think is the right balance there, Camille?
So I'd say that when it comes to policies, so policy commitments, definitely going for timeless, systematic would be the way to go. I think where examples come in more useful is where we get to those where embedding and also the performance type indicators, because this is where a description of a process until there's an example. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly in practice what's happening. But I say that wherever we're looking for specific examples, we won't be looking for the example on its own. It will be a description of a systematic process and then an example of how that works to support the general description. And that's what I meant when I said we're looking for systematic processes rather than individual case studies. While individual case studies can be helpful in painting a picture and telling a story, it's on their own, they don't necessarily demonstrate that the company is doing the same in the rest of its operations or with all of its business partners. So concrete examples, let's say, as a supplement of description of systematic processes.
Thanks, Camille. That's really useful. And I think our investors will probably take some of this forward in terms of their dialogues, because I think many times one hears about a policy or hears about a process, but has no real insight into how it actually works and some of the outcomes. That's really useful. Thank you. We're ready at 11:32. And so I want to turn now to our interaction with Pat and Lauren. And so what we're going to do here, we've got 6 case studies that they're going to touch upon, beginning with Lauren. We're going to touch on apparel, retail, technology, the private prison industry, finance, the financial sector, and mining. Collectively, they have quite a few years of experience here, so I'm sure there's a lot that they can share with us. I've asked them to speak about 3 minutes to each case study for each industry, because we want to leave ideally 10 minutes of questions at the end. Please do, during their exchange, continue to type any questions you might have in the Q&A, and please not in the chat function. So I'm going to hand it over now to Lauren and Pat. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here today.
Great, thanks, Rebecca and Camille. I think what we want to do is make our examples, make sort of what Camilla and Rebecca have talked about, make it live. So I wanted to start with an apparel example, and just to say that what we look at in terms of a human rights policy from companies is what international norms and stakeholders are included. But we look more generally at 4 different buckets: oversight and governance, risk and impact assessment, implementation, remediation, and remedy. And I think one of the prime examples of human rights due diligence and risk assessment gone wrong is Rana Plaza. And this is why I thought it would be a good example to start with. We had one of the most egregious, human rights tragedies happen with thousands of deaths in Rana Plaza in a factory. This was at a point in, I think, 2013, where we already had the expectation that companies should have full visibility of their supply chain. And I think on one side, it's a really good example of insufficient human rights due diligence and ongoing risk assessment, but it also serves as a good model for robust remedy and remediation and collective action. And I think that's also something really important to highlight. We look at when things go wrong, what type of remediation, what type of remedy, and specifically what remedy was given to the victims, what kind of structural investments were being made by companies and their suppliers, how are they reformulating kind of their supplier relationships, including looking at increasing capacity building, for example. And I think it brings home the fact that sometimes even as investors, we have to do our own due diligence and talk to impacted stakeholders, including factory workers. And that's actually some steps that we did take. And Pat, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about some of the ways in which you look at this issue.
Thanks, Lauren. First of all, I agree with everything Lauren said, and we look at the same things, but I wanted to focus a little bit on a couple other things we look at, and that's training, intelligence from the ground, and really understanding where the company is in its own life cycle. So on training, what I wanted to bring up, when we talk about retailers or multinational companies, those with chains, who is it that we're looking to be trained on the human rights policy? Is it the staff in the corporate office? Is it the staff in the facility? When we get to franchises, we often get pushback that I don't want anything to do with how the franchise actually works. And so that's a piece that we really need to understand. Who has control who do they have control over as the company? Because it really does impact everything. What goes on at that chain really impacts what the brand has. The other piece I wanted to talk about is understanding the company. When we talk about retailers, if you're in the US, the large ones of Walmart, Target, Costco, those kinds of companies, we've had multi-year, back to the 1990s, of engagements going on. And very often, many of the same shareholders involved in these engagements. And so we know a lot about the company, but we need to understand that company. Are they going through a growth spurt? Are they going through downsizing? Have the people that have been in charge of this all of a sudden been entirely replaced? We ran into one company this spring where the entire supply chain was replaced. Now, a lot of it had to do with COVID, but it was a revamping of their entire supply chain. And what does that mean in terms of human rights? Is it that the whole effort towards human rights was embedded in one particular person and their passion, or was it truly throughout the culture of the company? How do I assess that when I go on? One of the things I look at is who's at the table. I've been at the table at times where there's 5 lawyers and 1 investor relations and maybe 1 person from inside the company. That doesn't tell me that this project is really embedded in the company. When I look at it and there's 12 people from the company and 1 investor relations person just kind of there listening, then I know that there are more people that are involved. And one last part is, when do I step back and look at escalating or possibly filing a resolution? And it's when we see that nothing has actually been in the public domain. Very often companies will use these engagements as telling us their internal secrets. We're doing this, we're doing that. But if nothing's in the public domain, we may need to step back and then move to escalation or a new resolution. And I'll turn it over to Lauren to give an example around technology.
Thanks, Pat. And actually, I do think it is really important to highlight the fact that we're looking for robust disclosure, not just on what's included in the human rights policy, but how it's implemented and how do they deal with issues that arise, and how do they deal with their own, how do they deal with especially fire, things that happen quickly, like Rana Plaza. So in terms of technology, I think this is an area where a good formal set of principles and a set of standard kind of expectations has been put into place. And this is something called the Global Network Initiative principles. And so this was actually really helpful for investors to understand how companies that joined GNI were assessing and managing and disclosing how they were dealing with requests for government requests for information around users and who was part of their platforms. But I think what's really important to highlight is that in technology, the use of language and expectations have changed so quickly that really looking at how companies in the tech sector are evolving their understanding of their human rights risks and impacts is really important. And so this is an area where we're looking at how they're changing risk assessment and risk management and impact assessment. And moving beyond, I would say, the kind of traditional focus on government requests and transparency around that, to user rights and looking at how to balance, for example, data security, privacy, freedom of expression, and also jurisdiction-specific issues. And so for us, one of the most important things we've looked at over the last few years is the use of AI and algorithms and facial recognition technology, and how are companies keeping up with looking at not only the outcomes of kind of existing products, but actually how human rights can be impacted for users and other stakeholders in the product design phase. So where human rights impact is also assessed and is I think equally important. And I'll hand it over to Pat for the next example. Pat, I think you're on mute.
trying to get off. One of the things that we did was take an industry sector, and that's with the prisons. And for over a decade, we've been working with prisons. We had seen not only a lot of deaths in the prisons, but a lot of human rights issues around visitation, around the cost of telephone calls. And so we began asking private prisons for a human rights policy. And it's a tale of two companies, a tale of two cities, because there were really different responses in these. The one company, both of them wrote human rights policies within the first year that we asked for this. But the one company, when nothing changed, we began to say, well, could you do an assessment of how you've implemented your policy? Basically looking at those things like training that was out there. And they postponed a lot of the meetings. They didn't allow some of the team members that were there to participate. We then were invited to the prison, and I got what I call the dog and pony show. Look how good we're doing. We're doing this, that, and the other thing in the facility. Later on, we got what I call a handler. We got a DC lawyer who was the only way for us to talk and get into that company. And there were several meetings on training that were supposed to happen that didn't come off. So in 2018, we filed a new resolution asking for a human rights report. And as timing would have it, there were a lot of articles about what was going on in the prison system, a lot because of the immigration detention that was going on. And we garnered 89% of the vote. Well, within that next year, we saw an interest in engaging with us, now up to twice a year on dialogues. We also saw the CEO stepped aside and legal counsel had new people appointed, which gave us a direct entree into the company. The other private prison that we engaged had the same basic ask, the same dialogue team, same expectations, and we've not had to go back on new resolutions. What we found is we asked for a human rights assessment and they got an outside independent firm to do it. They're now redoing their human rights policy and have come to us. Neither of those companies, can I say, are at a point that we don't see human rights issues in them, but there's a definite difference in how we approach them. And what is that difference? How do we assess it? Is it management? Is it an attitude towards investors, an attitude towards how we might be helpful for the company? It's never quite clear. Is it the location of the company or the culture? We have one in Tennessee, one in Florida. It's really different cultures as to how they approach things. Again, we hope it's not based on one individual that's really taken this as a passion and grown it within the company, but that it becomes real cultural difference for both companies. And now I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Great, thanks, Pat. And I agree with a lot of what you say. Actually, having the same set of expectations with a group of companies, you see very different results for a whole variety of reasons. Sometimes it's their business model, sometimes it's where they're located. And I would say what's been very helpful for us in looking at specifically digital human rights have been benchmarks like the corporate human rights benchmark and ranking digital rights. So looking at a standard set of KPIs or metrics to assess a company on, I think has given a broader set of investors more visibility. I just wanted to chime in on kind of looking at the same ask can have very different results. But I think in terms of finance, I think what's really interesting here is that many of us have been engaging the banks for years on climate risk, right, and climate impacts, and how they're looking at how they're managing this really systemic issue. But what we realized is many of the companies, many of the banks were managing climate as an E issue and not looking at an integrated approach. And so one of the projects that has come up over in recent years is DAPL, or the Dakota Access Pipeline project, where this is a really good example of, for example, impact assessment was done, an environmental and social impact assessment was done by an external group, the U.S. government actually. What we realized though was that the banks themselves weren't really reading in between the lines and weren't really looking at what the real risks and the real red flags were. And what happened is that, I think they were a bit blindsided by the call to look at Indigenous people's rights. So this idea of looking at energy transition, looking at environmental impacts, and looking at human rights or social impacts. And the banks really paid a price. I mean, not only did they have huge reputational risk, there was also brand risk, and customers were threatening to leave. And what this sort of honed in on is that you can't have a check the box for human rights impact or human rights due diligence. And in fact, what we realized is that many of the banks thought, okay, an environmental assessment was done. There's been some engagement with the Indigenous peoples, check the box, right? The process was completed. And what they realized was that that was not enough. And I think this brings home the idea of not only an integrated approach to looking at energy transition, but also this idea that there needs to be internal capacity and resources for financial sector, for the financial sector, versus just relying on external resources. And in fact, a group of banks came together and had their an individual impact assessment done by an external group, Fully and Hogue, I believe, which highlighted some of the real risks that were involved in this. And I think one comment to make, and sort of the end of my sort of commentary, is that I think it's really important for us, as we're looking at investing in renewable energy transition, that we have to take an integrated approach, and we have to look at the impact to communities and Indigenous peoples and human rights defenders. And in fact, this is going to become even more of a potential risk as we lean into green and renewable energy. And we're already seeing this come up quite a bit in the solar sector.
And I'll just take it from there and continue to talk about the expertise of people on the ground. You mentioned Indigenous folks. And when we talk about mining, we have a lot of community groups that want to talk to us, and they want to say their basic ask is for the mine to close down and stop mining. And many of them are environmental groups. Sometimes it's a second or third generation where parents had agreed to mining earlier and now they're not excited. But I think we need to realize what we can do and make sure we're clear with those groups that we're not going to close down a mine. We can maybe make them more responsible, but we can't actually close down. On the other side, however, when we talk to mining companies, some of those companies want us to bring the people to the table. And what we found is many of the communities don't want to sit down with mining companies at the table. And so being real clear on what our boundaries are, I think is very important as we look at this. And some of the things that I keep talking to companies is that we can't have FPIC or free prior informed consent as a one-time thing as you go into a neighborhood, but it needs to be continuous. It needs to be as the next generation's there. With mining companies, you're talking 30 to 40-year lifespan of a mine, 2 to 3 generations of people involved, and we really need to make sure that that's a continuous effort. The other piece in mining that I'd mention is we very often in a mine have 2 different companies that are working there. One large company may control 40% of the mine, the other large company controls 60%. And what we often get from the minority owner, is that we turn all the human rights issues over to the majority owner. And that can't be. If you've got a human rights policy, it needs to impact everything, even when you're not the majority owner. And so that's a point to bring up. The last point on mining I'd bring up is around what I call legacy issues. And it's either when a company buys a mine, what human rights issues are they buying into and they now have to implement, or when they sell. Very often as a mine gets near its end, it's not as productive, they sell off that mine. And how do they assure that the human rights agreements are formalized into the sale of purchase or sale of a mine? And so with that, I'll turn it back to Rebecca.
That was wonderful. Thank you both. Those were great examples from 6 different industries, and you remained on time, which means we now have 10 minutes to have a bit of a Q&A. I'm going to ask Camille and Lauren, please do come back. Maybe we can all be on screen. So just, I'm going to look over at the Q&A box over here. There are a few questions that came in. I'm going to thank Camille. She actually already responded to a question from Richard Jones regarding some research and benchmarking on the vulnerability of workers who've during the pandemic, and Camille has shared helpfully a link to the COVID-19 study that the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark has done on company responses. On the note of responses to COVID-19, there was actually a question that came in from Manoj Singh. Manoj, I'm going to ask you to please maybe reformulate that a little more clearly, as I'm not quite sure what you were asking there and of whom. Helpful for folks to also direct their questions. But I'm going to actually turn to a question that Richard had asked, because I think it follows nicely from some of the things that both you, Pat and Lauren, have said, but in particular, Pat, you kind of talked a little bit with regards to mining, maybe what some of the limitations are in terms of what investors can or cannot do, or how they will be able to push companies to respond to some severe human rights situations. And Richard asks here, do you think investors prefer organizations to drop poor suppliers or to work with their suppliers to improve? And then he gave the example of the international accord that replaced the Bangladesh Accord. And so relevant for both retailers and the apparel industry. So maybe Pat, if you want to start, and then Lauren, if you want to add anything.
Sure. I think it depends what the definition of poor is for a supplier. If it's a security force with mining that's gone out and there's death and violence, we probably would ask for them to drop that supplier. On the other hand, if it's a supplier that can be worked with and that human rights policy can be part of a contract and that you can see improvement, then we might say, yes, go ahead and stay in and monitor it, and we want some transparent disclosure around it. But Lauren?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the case of Rana Plaza and the factories there, I think I think it was important for companies to commit to staying and actually address some of the systemic issues and weaknesses. And so in that case, I think we were more encouraging companies to keep suppliers and look at resources and capacity building. I think in the case where a supplier either is operating in a conflict zone or is is linked to supporting state-sponsored kind of forced labor, like in Uzbekistan and other regions of the world, there we actually have asked companies to consider exiting if there's no way to actually improve working conditions with those suppliers. But it's a hard call to make, and there are just some cases where exiting makes sense.
Yeah, I would add to that on retailers, Lauren. One of the things that we've seen is that many companies that had tried to spread their supply chain and never have too much in one vendor, that they've now merged them quite a bit so that they could work closer with the vendors that they have to try and improve life there.
Yeah, I think the trend towards fast fashion and investors are asking more for sustainable supply chains and investing with preferred kind of supplier relationships. And I think that's been sort of the ongoing call post Rana Plaza.
That's interesting, and I think this idea of maintaining longer term relationships with suppliers and working with them ties nicely into the question that Vaidi Sakdev has asked here, and she in particular is asking, points out that one of the challenges we find with companies that have goodish approaches don't understand the limitations of their primary approach to understanding human rights risks in their suppliers, and to namely use supply chain social audits, and why this might be insufficient for carrying out due diligence. And as she points out, it's difficult for companies to understand why they should or shouldn't be relying heavily on audits, social audits, and how those audits fit within the wider human rights due diligence efforts. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about that relationship between auditing and effective due diligence. I'll go to you, Pat, and then Lauren.
Sure. Auditing, especially during COVID, has become very, very hard. The other thing that I would add here is that we've seen some trend to companies pulling in their audit function and not using external auditors. And I get very suspicious when I see that. Lauren?
We realize, I think, that a lot of issues like worker voice and worker impacts sometimes are not sufficiently covered by social audits. So I think you need to look at a variety of tools, right? I mean, audits are important, but I also think for those companies that are relying on kind of a more collective kind of audit process, or underneath kind of a standard industry kind of association, like RBA, for example, you need to understand the limitations of the collective action, right? And then have some checks and balances individually with the companies. And so like shadow audits, or, I think you need a variety of tools, especially as we saw happening during COVID. And a lot of companies are now moving towards more technology-based kind of assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Camille, please do jump in here as well.
Thank you. Yeah, no, just wanted to add, because that's also definitely a question we get from companies a lot. And so it's seeing audits more as perhaps a reactive approach, looking at breaches that there have been and then putting in place corrective actions. Whereas due diligence is much more of a preventive approach, of taking a step back, thinking ahead of what are our key risks and what are we going to put in place to manage those risks effectively. Of course, those audits can then serve as input into the due diligence process, because if you know what issues you've had in the past with your suppliers, where you know that they're likely to come up again. So it's useful information to feed into that process, but it can't replace that process, which is much broader and systematic.
And then you want to see remedy on both the audit and the due diligence.
I think that brings up the question, Rebecca, of agency and the role, right? And whether, and again, linking to human rights language, what is your potential contribution? What's your influence? What role do you have? And I think in the case of human rights and the role of agency, I think banks in particular have said, for example, we're only a minority partner. We only have a minority stake in this project. And we say, unfortunately, you're painted with the same brush as the group that has the majority of investment, say, in a project. And so I think banks in particular, financial institutions, underestimate the potential human rights risks they're exposing themselves to, even with minor investment.
Thanks, Pat. Lauren, that's a very good point. We've got about 2 minutes left. I think we have a final, very interesting question. I'm just going to ask to go around. So Camille, Lauren, Pat, if you want to take a position on this, and if you want to add any additional closing statement or remark. So the question is from an anonymous attendee: is do you see a difference in terms of how companies respond to inquiries, from investors and others about how they're performing with regards to human rights, depending on whether human rights due diligence has already been included in mandated legislative or regulatory initiatives versus more voluntary thing? And of course, we see the trend within the EU towards mandated human rights and environmental due diligence, not quite there yet, but certainly in some countries, Germany, France, the Netherlands, versus the US, where very much more so a kind of voluntary thing. So legislation, how much does it matter? So Camille, then Lauren, then Pat.
So it definitely matters, but with the benchmark, we've not yet been able to see the consequence, because in the few countries where it's been implemented already, it was with a kind of a delay, like a period of time before it would actually come into force. And so the last benchmark we've published was in 2020, with the assessment covering kind of half of 2020 and 2019. So it was kind of too early for that to be captured. But I'm really convinced that once this treaty comes into force and the EU legislation as well, we're going to see a big difference. And it's very much needed, because clearly the voluntary approach alone is not sufficient when we look at the results on due diligence currently.
I think, we've had a lot of experience with, like the California law that came into effect in 2010 and modern slavery laws. I think the effectiveness is also tied to assessment of the disclosures and potential enforcement action. And so I think that's really important because in many cases you'll see a copy and paste, right, on the disclosure front. So I think it's how regulators are using that information and how how they're assessing the quality of that disclosure and whether it's sufficient. And frankly, it's the way in which investors have assessed the quality of the disclosure and used it in their engagement. We've seen that, for example, with the UK Modern Slavery Act.
Yeah, I just add that I think it goes to show what the culture of the corporation is. We had one trucking company that had to do the Great Britain Transparency Act at one point because it applied to them. And we said, well, why can't you do that kind of reporting for your entire company? Because the rest of it was in the US. And they said, oh, we don't have to. And it doesn't apply here. Well, the more you can get transparent information and say, well, why are you doing over there that doesn't make a difference here? Why can't you have the same standards for your entire company? It's important.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. I'm just going to, Saba, if we can bring up the slide with the next webinars that are coming up. I should also just note on the back of this question, we are currently circulating a and in support of effective and timely mandated human rights and environmental due diligence within the European Union. So if you're interested in signing on, please do drop us an email and we'll send you that information. Upcoming webinars, we're out of time. Just briefly, you see them here. The next three are going to really go deep and analyze that human rights due diligence process. And we're going to close out talking about the effective stakeholder engagement and grievance processes. Check out the YouTube channel linked here, and we will be sending you this recording. I think we've had some real valuable input today and these slides as well, so you can peruse some of these resources. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks to our speakers, and have a great day. Bye-bye.